Sometimes it's really, really hard to find ourselves inside the words, inside the story, inside the liturgy, inside the Torah. And I think our tradition asks us to do that even when it feels really hard. Our tradition says, like God calling to Abraham, 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 and we say, Hineni, where are we? Where am I? Where are you? Where are we collectively together? And sometimes our texts are really challenging. Sometimes the stories that we tell, these stories that we tell on Rosh HaShanah are really challenging. And some of the language of the liturgy is really challenging, alienating even, pushes us away rather than draws us in, perhaps. And so for this second day of Rosh HaShanah, I mean, you didn't expect another sermon, right? We're very, 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 very delighted and happy to have with us a rabbinic student who is our rabbinic intern for the high holidays, Hindy, who I've known for quite a long time from Camp Ramah. And Hindy is a rabbinical student, a third-year rabbinical student at Hebrew College in Boston, which is where some of us know Reb Bracha, Sarah Bracha Gushuni, who's going to be co-leading Kol Nidre here actually next week. She also graduated from Hebrew College. And so for a few minutes, we're going to have a bit of a conversation about what we do with tough texts, what we do when the liturgy gets really hard, what we do when the stories feel like, what? That story again? How do I get there? So, Hindy, great to have you with us. Shana Tova.
Can you hear me?
I feel like we're making a podcast or something.
I know.
So it's okay. We can make it into a podcast. It's being recorded. But
People want to listen to more sermons.
So, Hindy, as I've introduced you, you're a rabbinical student. So how do you, as someone, like I remember when I was a rabbinical student, there was all of this kind of passion and idealism that I had when I went into rabbinical school, and it got sort of squashed out of me a little bit as I kind of, and so, I mean, it's sort of a two-part question. I mean, how do you keep your passion and your optimism? I mean, I think it's okay to say a little biographical note. Hindy actually grew up in a Chabad house. Her father's a Chabad rabbi, and so very much brought up in very traditional Jewish framework. So how do you hold on to that sense, or do you even hold on to that sense of like joy, passion, connection when we confront these really difficult stories and difficult texts?
Thank you. It's really beautiful to be here in this capacity and to reconnect with some familiar faces and to meet new people. So thank you, and thank you for listening at this point in the day. I can imagine the last thing you want to be doing is really listening even more and active listening. So to Rabbi Marc's point of do I, the answer is no, I don't. I'm never the optimistic rabbinical student heading into a career and delighted to serve the needs of the Jewish community. My approach has always been this really, really strong need that our communities are struggling with mental health and addiction, and we need to do something about it. And that's why I decided to go to rabbinical school, is to bridge that gap between this shame and shanda that's in our communities, and to have moments like this where at the Bima I can say things like, yes, I understand that struggle, and rabbis are humans, and as humans, we're not exempt from the human condition. And so I understand what pain is. And so at times, what makes it even more painful is when I want to turn to these texts for comfort, and I want to be able to hold my siddur in shul, and ask questions to God, like, okay, God, like, you put me in this world, you gave me this backpack to carry, now you're gonna have to help me take these steps with this pack on. And instead of it being like, yeah, Hindy, you got this, God's like being my big cheerleader, it's the story of Abraham and Isaac. And that's the text that I have to sit with in shul today and hold this confusion in the pain. So there's a lot of confusion when I turn to these texts. And as we were talking earlier in the learning session, I don't have answers. That's like the Jewish thing. Like I have questions. And I really wanted to sit with like-minded folk today and just open these pages and explore like what is actually going on here, and how can I be comfortable in this pain today. maybe not the whole year. Let's aim for today. Let's be realistic. How can I be comfortable today in this pain? And how can I sit in shul with this pain? And another thing that comes to mind, and maybe this is where I'll pause and we'll take some, I'm going to pause here. I hope that answered your question, and we'll continue on.
So I hear you that it's often, or maybe always, more about questions and answers, and I think that's one of the things, and I've spoken about this before. I mean, sometimes people look to religions to give answers, but really I think this is what you're implying, really good religion is about helping us ask the right questions and not always needing or wanting even to have the answers. And I think that when we think of religion just as, like if we approach that story of Abraham and Isaac with a sense that it's going to give us an answer, then the answer is kind of unbearable, because it says that sometimes God wants us to do unspeakable things like sacrifice our children. And in a world that is already so full of pain and suffering, the idea that that story is somehow going to help us make sense of that, rather than ask like questions. Like, what are some of the questions that we could ask? Like I said earlier, did Abraham pass the test, or did he actually fail the test? Was that really something that God wanted? Was it marking some transition in our people's history where actually it was like God saying, no, child sacrifice is not a thing. I don't want that, even though the story seems to say that is what he wants. But I'm curious by that phrase you used, being comfortable in the pain. Was that what you said?
Yeah. Being comfortable in sorry, go ahead.
But isn't it sometimes about being uncomfortable?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, there's an answer for a question that's not really answerable. Sometimes it's, And so let me figure out how to answer this. When reading this story that we read today with Abraham and Isaac, Abraham does something that I really, really love. When God calls out to Abraham, and when the angel of God calls out to Abraham, he answers the same way, and he says, Hindy, I'm here. Similar to what Adam does in the Garden of Eden story. When God calls out to Adam, obviously God knows where these people are, but it's this willingness to not just show up, but to verbally show up, and to exist within that shame, and to exist within that uncomfortableness, and to exist within what we would call sinning, and to still show up, and to say, I'm here. It's one thing to show up and to, just kind of like sit on the sidelines and just observe. It's another thing to show up and to be okay. So with the backpack that I'm carrying and everything in it, that I can actually say, hey, not only am I here, but I can verbalize it and say, I'm here. And that, I think, takes a lot of courage. I don't think that's something that just happens. I think that's something that takes a lot of work. And I think that's that uncomfortableness, is learning how to examine, I keep using this backpack metaphor, is learning how to look what's inside that backpack, unpack it. And if you've ever done a long camping trip, sometimes you really don't want to. It could be a little smelly in there and uncomfortable. And that's the uncomfortableness I'm talking about. When you look at it and it makes you stand back, right? You're like, oh no, I don't want you put your hands up. I don't want to be involved in this. But at the same time, that's my backpack. That's the one that has my name on it. That's the one that God's calling out, Abraham. That's the one that God's calling Hindy. This is your backpack. And it's my job. Nobody else is going to do it for me, to learn how to do that. I can ask for help, but essentially I have to be the one to open it, and I have to be the one to say, Hineni, I'm going to do this work. And that's really what the uncomfortable part is. And once I do it, and once I throw, metaphorically speaking, throw it all in the washing machine, I can sit back and watch the cycle do its thing. We have really great resources in our lives that we can actually, do those things. And then that's the easy part. That's the comfortable and the pain.
I love that metaphor in terms of the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of repentance that we're now starting, like taking all of the schmutzy, dirty, yucky stuff out of our backpacks and putting it in the washing machine, because that's really, that is the promise that our liturgy gives, that these days are for cleansing ourselves. So it's an opportunity to wash all of our, I was going to say a word that I probably shouldn't say, but just to wash the filth out of it all. But I'm curious though, Hindy, I think you're speaking very personally, and that's courageous. And I've known you long enough to know you're very open about bringing your vulnerability in, which is a very powerful thing, I think, to do as a leader sometimes. And there's also like how we bring that in a way, like you're about to become like a Rav b'Yisrael, like a rabbi for the Jewish people. And it's like, there's that classic phrase, which I've used before, which is that the role of a rabbi is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And when we're talking about like being comfortable and being uncomfortable, there are times when we're a little bit too comfortable. And how do you see the role of a Jewish leader as a rabbi to sort of push us a little bit into a place that's less comfortable? Do you see that as part of your role?
Yeah. To use the backpack metaphor again, we're going to go on this hike together. You're not going through this alone. Abraham doesn't go to the Akedah alone. He takes his right-hand man with him. And the beauty of Judaism, and why I deeply, deeply love Judaism is that we're a community-based religion. When we go through grief in community settings. When we have a simcha, a celebration, we do that communally. And then there's usually somebody orchestrating that for us. And that's how I envision the role of rabbi. I am not the gatekeeper of Torah. I don't hold any keys. But I do have a pretty good map of what hikes to go on. And I have some skills of how to adjust our backpacks. And being that I'm still a student, I still get to learn how we can unpack our backpacks together. And so that's how I envision my role really is more of a tour guide. Whether it's through the text of Torah and making sense of it, or asking difficult questions like why don't our shuls have spaces for AA meetings, and why does me as a Jew have to go to a church to do that? And navigating the maps of where we can what's the word I'm looking for? How we can navigate this world together. And that's really my role. As I keep saying, it's more of a tour guide than a gatekeeper is how I would respond to that.
And I'm sure there's always that special shovel in that backpack.
Yes.
That you need to bury little holes when you're outside the camp.
And yes, some non-vegan.
In the few minutes that we have left, Hindy, I'm just is there anything else specifically about this story, seeing as we approach this challenging text of the Akedah story? Because I think that I'll frame this by saying that I, as a rabbi and as someone who really appreciates the traditional liturgy and appreciates the traditional canon of Torah readings, it's like I've never wanted to throw stuff out when I don't like it. I'd rather wrestle with it. I'd rather reinterpret it. I'd rather reframe it for this new moment than just say, you know what, this doesn't work anymore. I'm not going to read this verse. I'm going to change this blessing to this. I'm going to cut this piece of the liturgy because I don't like what it's saying. And I think that there are ways in which Torah, we talk about Shivim Panim El Torah, like 70 faces of the Torah, which means really that is also a metaphor for an infinite ways to interpret these stories. So like this year specifically, with all that we are carrying as a community, with all of the trauma that I spoke about yesterday, it's not just COVID, it's like we are the 20th anniversary of 9/11 is in 2 days, right? The trial of the King Super Shooter is starting this week. With many of us are traumatized by that. We're still traumatized about what happened in January with the insurrection. I mean, there's all of these things. So how, in this moment, Hindy, is there anything that we can draw from that story of the Akedah that can help us ask better questions or help us frame this moment through the lens of Torah?
Yeah, that's a very heavy question. I think it's our responsibility to ask who's not in this story. The same way we have the responsibility to look around the room and outside and see who's not here. And who haven't we seen in this past year and a half. And very obviously in this story, one of the main characters not included in the story is Isaac's mother, Sarah. And where is she when all this is happening? Does she even know this is happening? Has anybody checked up on her? And one little footnote on this side, I think it's on page 105.
That today.
Yeah, the where is Sarah? And it's the Satan that's checking up on her. And like, how horrible is that? Why isn't it her friends and her peers her rabbi, her congregants checking up on her? Why is it this angel of death-like figure that's the one checking up on her? And so I think if there's any takeaway that I glean from this story as we are in a really, really painful time in our lives, is that we need to be asking, who's not here? Whose voices do we not hear? And who's checking up on them? It doesn't mean that I have to be the one to go and check up on all 300 people that would normally be here and aren't here. But it does mean that I have to ask those 2 or 3 or 4 people and then actively check in on them and say, hi, how are you? Shana Tova, I've really missed you this past year and a half. I'd love to reconnect. Even if it's virtually, and to just slowly build up these relationships without expectation, and to really frame it from a sense of friendship and care and compassion, and with the understanding that we've all changed and we've all been impacted by this, and we're all grieving and we're all in pain, but we do really need each other, and it's only going to happen if we can ask that question of who's not here and who do I miss and how can I reconnect with them.
I feel very, very moved by that, Hindy, because I sometimes feel like the pitfall of being a rabbi is like sometimes if there's someone you haven't seen for a really long time and you call them up, there's this capacity that is going to make them feel good. Yeah, no, I'm so sorry, Rabbi, I haven't been to shul for a long time, and then they get all the excuses, and it's like to approach it in the way that you're saying, just like, I've missed you. I want to check in. I want to know how you are. Not like I need to know if you're. I mean, we talked a little about this last night with in relation to a friend. But like, how do we do that? How do we really show our care for each other without making each other feel guilty? And I think that's not just something for rabbis. I think that's all of us. It's like sometimes if we ask a question in the wrong way, it makes someone feel guilty rather than loved and appreciated and seen and cared for. And so I really appreciate that framing. Finally, we're about to get into Musaf, which is in some ways the sort of aching heart of Rosh HaShanah and Yom Kippur, the Musaf service, which is very, very powerful, and it's also disturbing and challenging. One of the texts that we read is the Unatana Tokef, which has this incredible history to it, which we won't go into right now, but in terms of like the way in which it was composed, if you're interested in finding out more about it, look it up. There's probably notes about it in the Machzor, I can't remember, but like the power of that liturgy is basically, who's going to live and who's going to die? Who's going to die by fire? Who's going to die by water? Right? Who's going to die by a plague? Which of course sticks out, and magefa, sticks out so much in this, year and a half with COVID. Who's going to be old when they die? Who's going to be young when they die? And it's, on one level, it seems to sort of present this horrible randomness about the universe, that everything is somehow going to be decreed. It's going to be written on Rosh HaShanah. It's going to be sealed on Yom Kippur, Rosh HaShanah. Like we sing it in this sort of like waltzy kind of fun way. Like it's going to be written on Rosh HaShanah and it's going to be sealed on Yom Kippur. Who's going to live and who's going to die? But it's like there's something quite disturbing and dark about it. So how do we deal with that as a challenging text?
We cry. That's my initial reaction, is that it's hard to not imagine people who've suffered through these texts for me when we read through them, especially this year when our world is in such a climate crisis and COVID has taken lives of people that we really love. And then there's been many more illnesses that we just haven't been able to show up for each other with because of the restrictions of COVID. And so this text this year is extremely, extremely painful. And I don't have an answer or a way of meaning making right now. For me, it's too soon. Come back to me at the end of the Shemitah cycle that we just started yesterday, and maybe I'll have, this is what I learned. But right now, I just need to sit with it. And hold these people dear. And just use this prayer as a time to just ask God for all the blessings, that this stops and that it doesn't impact the people I love. And on the flip side, it's also really hard because I know these things. I'm a little bit of a control freak. And so it's really hard for me to look at these texts and realize there's not really much I can do. You know, and when someone's time is up, their time is up, and all I can do is really hold on to these memories. And so I hope that this year when we go through these texts is that I have that ability to just remember these people that I really love, and to really pray for the people that need the healing that I wish that God would keep around a little bit longer. Because, yeah, it's painful. It's really, really, really painful.
Wow. Thank you. Yeah, I don't think, and we will wrap this up and go into our Musaf, but I don't think that the text even attempts to offer an answer. It offers a recommendation. It offers a sort of way in which, even if we know that we have no control over the stuff that's going to happen to us and to people we love over the course of a year, it says, you know, Teshuva tefila tzedakah marvin et roh hagezerah, which means, you know, teshuva, like looking inside, tefillah, like having some kind of relationship with God, however we imagine God, and tzedakah, like how we interact with each other in society. But what's important about that text, it doesn't say, if you're good in all of those three places, then no bad stuff will ever happen to you. It's a guarantee. It doesn't say that at all. And some people, I think, misread it and mistranslate it as that. It says, if we're good in those three areas, in our internal relationship, in our, I don't know, horizontal, vertical, however you imagine your relationship with God relationship, and with the ways in which we interact in society, doing tzedakah, giving generously and caring for each other and helping tikkun olam, then it takes the sting out of what's going to happen. Ma'avirin is really about a sort of almost like a transcendent, and roa hagezerah doesn't mean it, the gezerah, which is the decree, isn't annulled. It's just slightly softened. It's still going to happen. We know that this year is going to bring what it's going to bring, and we have little control over it. All we have control over is how we respond to those things when they happen, and that's, I think, what the prayer is inviting us to do, right?
Yeah. I'll say, just to wrap up my thoughts on this, is that the thing that I actually do find comfort in, because I don't want to leave you hanging with this like very obvious pain, is just seeing you. And yesterday being able to lead programs with kids and having them ask the most adorable questions. You know, like, why do we have the various sounds of the shofar? And just seeing their imagination at work. And so my blessing to all of us is that we're able to imagine again. And we're able to enter into a year and hope and dream and play and laugh and ask questions like we're little kids again, and just have this beautiful sense of wonderment and fall in love with our world again and fall in love with each other again. And I hope that even as we walk out the doors today, that we're able to have a little bit of that as well, and we don't leave as heavy as we enter the building. We leave just a little bit lighter. I think that would be really good, and that would make this pain a little bit more comfortable, as I would say, just a little lighter. So thank you. And thank you for giving me the space.
Amen to that beautiful way to end.
Share.
Thank you, Hindy. Thanks for this conversation. Shana Tova. Great to have you with us. So we'll